Welcome, everyone. I have Eric James Stone with me today. He's a science fiction author. Eric, why don't you give the audience a bit about your background and bio?
Yeah, I've had over 50 short stories published in various magazines, including Analog Science Fiction and the scientific journal Nature. In fact, according to the scientific journal Nature, I am the author of the greatest science fiction story ever written. That was the title of the story of mine they published. I won a Nebula Award for a novelette back in 2011. My first novel came out from Baen a few years ago. I've had 2 collections of short stories published. And I'm currently serializing an epic fantasy novel on Kindle Vella.
And where can people check that out?
Basically by going to the Kindle Vella store and searching for Eric James Stone.
Okay, and then who would you say are your, well, let me step back. How did you get into the whole writing game?
Yeah, well, it goes back to when I was growing up, my dad had a large collection of science fiction and fantasy anthologies. So I read a lot of short fiction growing up. One in particular was a collection called The Early Asimov that had a bunch of Asimov's early science fiction stories. And in between, he kind of talked about his life and what was going on when he wrote the story and stuff like that. And that was the first time that I kind of thought, hey, it would be sort of cool to be a writer. So I took some creative writing classes in college. I was lucky in that the creative writing teachers at BYU at that time did not object to my putting a science fiction or fantasy spin on things when I wrote them. So I wrote some stories, and I took the best one of the stories I'd written and sent it out, and it got rejected, and I sent it out again and it got rejected. And I said, I guess I'm not cut out to be a writer. And I gave up on writing for 10 years, which I always tell people it was my big mistake. So then in 2002, all of a sudden I had this urge to write an epic fantasy novel. And so I started working on that, and I decided to help myself with accountability and stuff like that, that I would take a creative writing class. So I took a community education class on creative writing. And the teacher said, hey, well, while you're working on your novel, have you thought about writing some short stories to get your name out there? And I said, no, I haven't thought about that. So I took one of my class writing assignments, expanded it, polished it up, sent it out, got a rejection from Analog on it, but it was, an encouraging rejection. And I sent it to the Writers of the Future contest, and it ended up being a finalist and then a published finalist. And that was my first publication. And then from then on, I started selling pretty consistently. And so now that epic fantasy novel that I started off me on the path of writing again, that's what I'm serializing on Kindle Vella now. It's called Heir of the Line.
And can you tell us a little bit more about, what that's about, in terms of the setting, background, etc.?
Yeah, it's basically it's about a young man who all he wants to do is be a protector of the line, to protect the king, who is actually also his best friend. They were born on the same day when the castle was attacked, and so he's grown up wanting all his life to protect the king, who was born partially paralyzed because of what happened during the attack. And then he's going to have to help with, a regent who's plotting against the king, and various things. And, ultimately, the characters are going to have to face off against the high priestess of the dark god. So that's, I will say it's a pretty typical epic fantasy. So it's got a lot of the tropes in there that will be familiar to people. I hope I put my own spin on some of them. Yeah, so that's what that is.
And then how many, you said it was serialized. How many, what do you call them, episodes?
Episodes, yeah. There are going to be 65 episodes.
And where are you right now, so that people have an idea?
23 of them have been released so far. And all of them are written. So, there's no worry that it's going to get left off part way without ever finishing. So the whole story is written.
Yeah, I can think of 2 people off the top of my head, but I won't say any names. All right. So the good news is, while it hasn't been released, it is done, and you're not going to leave anyone hanging or waiting for the next installment.
Well, they have to wait for the next installment, but I'm releasing 3 installments per week.
Okay. Well, when I say waiting, I mean waiting with no end in sight, right? There's an end in sight. It's just they have to kind of get through everything and wait until it's released. In terms of your influences, who would you consider your primary writing influences? It sounds like Asimov is probably one of them.
Yes, Asimov was definitely one of them. Orson Scott Card has been a major mentor to me. I took his writing workshop and learned a ton there back before I was even published. And he had asked me to be an assistant editor on his online magazine, Intergalactic Medicine Show, which I did that for 5 years, and learned a lot during that time as well. Another mentor was the late Dave Wolverton. I took a novel writing workshop from him. And at that point, I had been writing 2 years and had written 50,000 words on the epic fantasy. He made me write an outline for it. I'd kind of had an outline in my head kind of thing, but he made me write an outline for it. I wrote an 11,000 word chapter by chapter outline for the whole novel. And after that, it took me 9 months to write 100,000 more words and finish it. So it really improved my productivity to outline. And so when time came for writing my next novel, I knew I had to outline it. And so I outlined my novel that came out from Baen, Unforgettable, and wrote the first draft of it over the course of 3 months.
Yeah.
It was only 60 some odd thousand words. So I ended up taking a few years to revise and expand it before it finally got picked up. But
yeah, so I know some people consider themselves pantsers, some are outliners. I actually went through the same exercise at the end of last year. And in a month, I wrote about half a novel, because it's just, you're not left wondering, like, what happens next. And I think that may be it may be effective for short stories, because there's not that much that can happen. But and this is, I think, a personal preference thing, but I think you're really rolling the dice if you kind of fly blind. But it sounds like you may have some, I guess, what they call pantser tendencies. Would you consider yourself a pantser or an outliner?
Um, with short fiction, I'd say probably half the time I know the ending before I start writing, and half the time I kind of discover the ending. Sometimes I know the ending and then discover that it's not the right ending. Um, so but yeah, another influence, major influence and mentor is Kevin J. Anderson, who invite, after he got to know me through Writers of the Future, he invited me to an anthology. I did a good job on that, so he invited me to more. And so he and just his career advice in general has been phenomenal.
Any other influences?
Interestingly enough, Jane Austen. It's I somehow managed to avoid reading Jane Austen in high school and college. So it wasn't until quite a bit later that I actually started reading Jane Austen. Interestingly enough, because of the movie Clueless, I decided to see what it was, read the original source material. And so I read Persuasion, and then pretty much I've read all of her novels now. And it's I don't know, it just something about the interplay between the characters and stuff like that I just found fascinating. And I try to have similar sorts of interplays between my characters when I'm writing.
Now, what contemporary authors do you enjoy reading today?
Brandon Sanderson, number one. And I should mention, I'm in Brandon's writing group. So I get a lot of feedback from him on my writing. And so he's someone else who's really been very helpful to my writing. I've really enjoyed Mary Robinette Kowal's stuff, both her science fiction and her fantasy. Andy Weir, of course. I absolutely love The Martian, and I'm drawing a blank on his latest one, Project Hail Mary. And let's see, other. I'm a big fan of Larry Correa's work, and Adrian Tchaikovsky, his Children of Time novel is one of my absolute favorites. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head right now. I just finished listening to Ken Liu's third novel in his Dandelion Dynasty series, and it was fantastic, as always. I've been a fan of Ken's almost since the beginning of his career, and I just anything he writes, I'm a fan of.
All right, yeah. So I would encourage everyone listening to this or watching the show to check out all those authors, because there are a lot of like, in terms of the styles, and they're all very different styles too, I think.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. You have stories in both. Weird World War III, you want to talk about that story first,
Sure.
giving away too much.
Yeah.
But before you start, one thing I really liked about both stories is you really kind of get into the kind of Cold War mindset. Even in the Weird World War IV story, you kind of got into that mindset, even though it happens after kind of World War III. yeah, exactly. And you tie it nicely. There's always a very strong linkage to actual historical events. Like you're able to deftly kind of knit together your future with the actual historical past. So if you could tell the audience a little bit about first your World War III story, and then the one that's coming out next week.
Yeah. So for Weird World War III, basically, I decided, well, what if the U.S. And the Soviet Union had carried out a war by assassination, where they were assassinating each other's leaders directly, rather than a war with armies. And so that was the initial concept I came up with. I sent that pitch to you, and you said, "Okay, but what's the weird part?"
Right.
And so I was like, well, and then I thought of the old CIA psychic programs, MK Ultra and stuff like that, and I was like, well, what if they decided to try to psychically assassinate people?
By the way, the Soviets did try to do exactly that. But
that was the genesis of the story idea. And I have to say, I did a ton of research into, okay, well, if this person gets assassinated, who would become president? Who was likely to become president in the next election? And things like that. And on the Soviet side, okay, so if Khrushchev gets killed, who comes next? If Brezhnev gets killed, who comes next? And stuff like that. So I spent a lot of time going down that rabbit hole. But I think I did a pretty good job of portraying what that actually.
It's definitely that was one of the more intriguing parts of the story. Like I really enjoyed that.
So yeah, and the whole idea of being able to see these, the conversations in the White House about assassinations, and having a psychic being the one seeing them, that basically, once I had that, the whole story just kind of fell into place. So, and then for Weird World War IV, I had to decide what the World War III had been. And I came up with the idea that during when the Soviet Union was collapsing, that someone, started a nuclear war. And so that's the World War III part. And then for the World War IV thing, I thought, well, what if, Europe's been partially depopulated? What if the Neanderthals, who have been living underground for 40,000 years, decide now it's time to come back out? And one of the historical incidents that I remembered was that there were astronauts actually just one astronaut on the Mir space station when the Soviet Union fell. And I thought, well, what if, there was an astronaut up there who sees the, World War III happening, basically. He sees from the space station, the nukes going off and stuff like that. And he's able to return to Earth in the aftermath. But I decided to make him one of my characters. And it, weirdly enough, it wasn't until after I had finished the story that I realized that I had written an astronaut versus caveman story. I don't know if you're familiar with the the question of who would win in a fight, an astronaut or a caveman. On the TV show Angel, two of the characters engaged in a very heated argument over who would win on that. And so that was probably in the back of my mind, but didn't come to the front of the mind until after I'd actually written the story.
Well, you definitely get the answer.
Yes,
right?
yes. So yeah, and so basically, I made the choice to tell the story entirely from the point of view of a Neanderthal scholar who is part of the war effort. And I also had to do some, research into nuclear physics and things like that for the story.
Yeah, I thought it was a great. I appreciated the way that you had created the Neanderthal culture, including like linguistic patterns that are, different. And I thought like the world building for, it's still just a short story, but I thought that it was exceptional world building, and it was very different, right? And then not only that, with all the complexity that's layered in, you can still tell the story, or you can kind of in one sentence explain what the story is about without giving too much away.
Yeah.
So I thought that was some pretty good stuff. What sort of advice would you give to new writers who are, starting to submit and trying to get things published?
Well, first off, don't give up after 2 submissions. Basically, one of the things I decided to do was to make it a goal to submit to the Writers of the Future contest every quarter until I either won or had so many pro sales that I could no longer enter the contest. Mm-hmm. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a contest for new writers. Because either of those outcomes is a good outcome. Either I win the contest or I've made pro sales. So that would be one major piece of advice.
And if you could tell the audience a little bit more about the contest and why they should enter. The contest, right?
Yeah, the contest is for new writers, so you can't have had more than 3 or 4 professionally published short stories, and you can't have published a novel. But if you get prize money, plus they pay you a pro rate for your story to include it in the anthology if you're one of the 3 quarterly winners. And the 4 first place winners from the quarters in the year are all up for a grand prize of $5,000. My wife actually won that a few years ago. So she's got a much bigger trophy than I do because I was only second place in my quarter. So then they fly you out to LA for a week-long writers' workshop and awards ceremony. The new David Wilverton, Dave Farland was the coordinating judge, but he passed away, and so they just announced the new coordinating judge is Jody Lynn Nye. And so she and Tim Powers will be running the workshops going forward. And all in all, it's you get paid, you get frankly, nobody ever pays as much attention to a short story you've written. Even when I won Nebula, it wasn't as big. They didn't make as big a fuss about it as the Writers of the Future award ceremony. And the networking there, with the other winners and with the judges and stuff like that is invaluable.
And then how can people enter the contest?
Go to writersofthefuture.com. They've got submission guidelines and a place to upload your entry. You can enter year round. There are 4 quarterly deadlines, but you can submit, upload pretty much any time.
Any last words for writers or your fans or anything like that before we go to the next topic?
Yeah, write what you're passionate about. Those are the things that your passion comes through in your writing, and so I feel like that makes the story more impactful.
All right. Well, thank you. And we're going to move on to the next topic.